So our next session is the intersection of sustainability and traffic safety. And I would like to hand it over to Carrie Olson.
And thanks so much, Geraldine, and welcome everyone to this session in which we're going to get to dive into the intersection of climate sustainability action and air quality with traffic safety. We're very fortunate to have two accomplished researchers who are going to be sharing their work with us, followed by reflections from a distinguished member of the British Parliament. We plan to have, as mentioned earlier, time for Q&A at the end of the session. So as you think of questions for the presenters, I encourage you to, if you're like me, you might want to write them down. So feel free to pop them in the chat. And then, or at the end, you can save them and then come off mute and ask them then. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Masha Pithirangan, who I'm very privileged to work with here at the New York City Health Department. She's an environmental scientist with our air quality program, which runs the New York City Community Air Survey, or NYCAS, as we like to call it, which is a citywide network of about 100 air pollution monitoring sites. Masha analyzes data on air pollution, emission sources, and health to understand source contributions and, most importantly, those health impacts. Masha, I'm going to turn it over to you to share some of your findings with us.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. Bear with me as I share my screen now. Can everyone see it?
Looks good.
You can.
Great. So hi, everyone. I'm Masha Pithirangan from the New York City Department of Health, and I'm here to present a study we did on the effects of the COVID-19 shutdown on air pollution in New York City, and to discuss the implications of our findings for traffic policy. So starting off with a bit of background, as we all know, at the start of the pandemic, many governments all over the world implemented lockdown measures to reduce the spread of COVID-19. And in New York, there was a statewide executive order known as NY Pause, which shut down all non-essential business and officially lasted from March 22nd, 2020 to June 7th, 2020. And the changes in economic activity that resulted had effects that cascaded across many aspects of everyday life, including fine particulate and nitrogen dioxide pollution. And these air pollutants are important from a health perspective because they've been linked to adverse respiratory, cardiovascular health outcomes, as well as premature death. And so the abrupt changes in activity that occurred during New York's shutdown have allowed us to evaluate the potential for future regulations on major emission sources, such as traffic, to reduce air pollution. So we characterize changes in PM 2.5 and NO2 pollution using data from the New York City Community Air Survey, or NYCAS for short. NYCAS is run by the Air Quality Program at the New York City Department of Health in partnership with the City University of New York at Queens College. And it's been providing high-density street-level measurements of air pollution since 2008. And we currently have about 100 sites, most of which are monitored once per season. And we use land use regression models to predict seasonal averages of citywide pollutant concentrations. So when we analyzed NYCAS data in a study of the air quality impacts of the COVID shutdown, we saw significant reductions in pollution. In New York City, the COVID shutdown lasted officially from March 22nd to June 8th, which mostly aligned with the NYCAS spring season. We looked at differences in the pollution change from winter to spring in 2019 and 2020 because PM 2.5 and NO2 pollution normally decrease from winter to spring. There are sources in the winter that we don't have as much of in the spring, such as boiler emissions due to space heating. And also winter weather tends to be more stagnant, resulting in the trapping of pollution in our air. And so in a paper that we published earlier this year, we performed difference in difference analysis using NYCAS data and concluded that the COVID shutdown resulted in a 25% reduction in PM 2.5 and a 29% reduction in NO2. So in order to understand how changes in specific emission sources contributed to the observed changes in air pollution, we examined data on the three major sources identified by our land use regression models: commercial cooking, traffic, and building boilers. And we found little evidence of change in building boiler emissions during the shutdown. So I'll focus on the other two sources for the rest of the presentation. So the NYPAWS executive order included stay-at-home orders, which directed individuals to limit outdoor recreational activities and use of public transportation. This likely had the effect of reducing traffic activity across New York. And the grouped bar chart over here shows that average daytime traffic speeds in spring 2020, which you can see in this dark blue bar, were faster compared to the winter just before, which is this kind of peach colored bar. And that was true across all road lengths monitored by the New York City Department of Transportation across the 5 boroughs. And that suggests widespread decreases in daytime traffic in New York City during the shutdown. And this is corroborated by the reduced congestion observed in Manhattan in this Shearston et al. Study, which analyzed the changes in traffic congestion during NYPAWS using Google traffic data. This figure from that paper shows a Manhattan with a lot of traffic congestion immediately before the shutdown, and you can see that in the orange and red segments here, and very little congestion immediately after the shutdown, seen by the widespread green segments. And the top graph here also shows evidence of traffic reduction in the city during the shutdown. You can see the drop in traffic volumes, and this is at the MTA bridge and tunnel crossings between these two solid red lines, indicating the span of the shutdown. And in the bottom graph, I've zoomed in on one corridor in the Central Business District, the eastbound Lincoln Tunnel, where we observed a convergence of PM 2.5 with urban background levels. And you'll see that this blue line shows the PM 2.5 measurements in Midtown near the Lincoln Tunnel, and the black dotted line shows the PM 2.5 at Queens College, which is our urban background site. So this convergence in PM 2.5 at these two sites was concurrent with the drop in travel times observed during the shutdown in the peak direction during morning rush. However, that convergence with PM 2.5 of PM 2.5 at these two sites was sustained even after traffic rebounded. And this suggests that a source other than traffic drove these changes in PM 2.5. And in case anyone's wondering what's happening over here after the dotted red line, that dotted red line marks the fall 2020 resurgence of COVID cases in New York City, and the steep decline in travel time observed during mid-morning rush in Midtown following this resurgence in cases was not accompanied by a proportionate decline in citywide traffic volumes shown up here. So that suggests that commuter traffic activity was more sensitive to change during the resurgence than other types of traffic. So PM 2.5 in Midtown remained suppressed even after traffic rebounded. What does this mean? When we look at an indicator of the other major source of air pollution in New York City, commercial cooking, we see evidence of reduced activity. And if you look at this bottom graph here, we see that small businesses in leisure and hospitality closed in large numbers during the shutdown, and many remained closed even after the shutdown. In addition to the stay-at-home order, the NYPAWS executive order shut down all non-essential businesses statewide and banned non-essential gatherings of any size, including in-person dining in restaurants. And commercial activity and commercial cooking in particular are major sources of air pollution in New York City. And in fact, the 2017 National Emissions Inventory attributes nearly 40% of local PM 2.5 emissions in New York City to commercial cooking. So reduced commercial cooking activity is the likely driver of PM 2.5 decreases during and after the shutdown. But traffic is the city's main source of NO2. And this Shearston et al. Study shows that the greatest percent reductions occurred during the morning and evening rush hours. So this study looked at changes in NO2 in New York City following the shutdown using different air pollution data than we did, and also saw significant reductions as a result of NY pause. And this figure shows the average percent reductions in NO2 during the shutdown by the hour. And this clock face shows the AM hours, this clock face shows the PM hours. And we see the largest percent reductions occurred between 5 and 7 AM and 6 and 7 PM. So the larger decreases in NO2 during the rush hour peaks suggests that the shutdown had greater impact on commuter vehicles than on freight vehicles. Also from the Shearston et al. Paper, this table shows that while vehicle counts of all classes decreased from March to April, truck counts didn't fall by as much as automobiles and buses. And this is across all Port Authority bridge and tunnel crossings. You see here that the proportion of trucks making up overall traffic actually increased from March to April. And it's likely that congestion pricing will also affect commuter traffic more than freight traffic, because commuter modes of transport, but freight trucks will still need to make their deliveries. And the differential impact on truck traffic is important to note because truck emissions make up the majority of motor vehicle emissions in the city. And these emissions disproportionately impact high poverty communities. This figure is from a study released by scientists at the Health Department back in 2016. And the y-axis shows modeled PM 2.5 emissions from trucks and buses. And the x-axis shows percent poverty in different neighborhoods in New York City, represented by each of these dots. And we can see that higher poverty neighborhoods are exposed to higher levels of PM 2.5 from trucks and buses. And in addition to the variable impact on different types of traffic, we also saw uneven reductions in air pollution across the city. Though air pollution declined throughout the city during NY pause, our land use regression models show that the reductions are most pronounced in the central business district. This spatial pattern likely reflects what we'll see with congestion pricing because congestion pricing specifically targets traffic going into the central business district, and we can expect effects on air pollution to be more narrowly focused on that area. And this is important to note because the neighborhoods with the highest rates of poverty and air pollution attributable health outcomes are outside of the central business district. And these findings emphasize the importance of targeting pollution sources in communities that suffer the most from pollution exposure. So to conclude, NY pause resulted in a 25% drop in PM 2.5 and a 29% drop in NO2 citywide. Our findings give a sense of what can be expected from policies regulating traffic in New York City, such as congestion pricing. And congestion pricing is likely to have more of an effect on NO2, which mostly comes from traffic, than on PM 2.5, which has other major sources like commercial cooking. And congestion pricing is likely to have more of an effect on commuter traffic than on freight trucks, which we know have greater impacts on pollution exposure in high poverty communities. And because congestion pricing targets traffic going into the central business district, we can expect pollution reductions to be mostly focused on areas immediately surrounding the central business district, with smaller changes in parts of the city that experience the highest burden of poverty and air pollution related health impacts. And these findings emphasize the need to target pollution sources in communities that suffer the greatest from pollution exposure. If we're to design policy that reduces exposure inequities, We must actively regulate the specific sources affecting these overburdened and under-resourced communities. And I will end it there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Masha. I'm sure that, like everybody else, that you all have lots of questions, and this raises so many interesting ideas around this intersection between climate sustainability and what we're doing for air quality, as well as those traffic safety considerations. So looking forward to digging into those in our discussion shortly. But now I'm excited to introduce our second speaker, Bhavna Singachetti, who is a doctoral candidate in the Injury Prevention Research Center and the Department of Epidemiology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Bhavna received her MPH from the George Washington University and distinguished herself as a researcher at the Center for Injury Research and Policy at Nationwide Children's Hospital before going to Chapel Hill, UNC. Her research focuses on transportation safety, traumatic brain injury, and pediatric injury. And Bhavna, I'm really looking forward to learning from you now about safety in the context of congestion pricing. So please take it away.
Great, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Carrie. So I work on sharing my screen here. Can everyone see that? Great.
We can.
So today I'll be talking a little bit about safety impacts of congestion pricing policies. And like Carrie said, I'm from UNC in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, so a little bit away from New York City. So before I proceed, I just want to acknowledge that this work was supported in part by 2 awards. First, from the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, and second, from the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety here at UNC. So a little bit of background, which I think many of you are probably already familiar with. Congestion pricing policies, or CPPs as I will call them today, are travel demand management strategies that are meant to help alleviate roadway congestion. And this is done by encouraging traffic shifts to alternate lanes, routes, or even off-peak travel times. Toll-based strategies are one type of CPP, and they're often more popular and more heavily utilized. And these can include high occupancy toll lanes, express toll lanes, and zone-based pricing. So in this presentation today, I'm going to summarize the findings from a large 3-part project on congestion pricing policy with the focus on toll-based policies. So the first 2 parts of our project were 2 large reviews, because first we wanted to examine research output and patterns really surrounding toll-based congestion pricing policy and literature. And we did this using a couple different methods and then analyzed our data using novel bibliometric analysis tools. And then our second review was to hone in on one specific subject by synthesizing findings from publications that specifically looked at impacts on road user safety outcomes. So to conduct both of these reviews, we searched 4 large databases from the dates of their inception through January and February of 2021. And we used the definition of toll-based policies as outlined by the Federal Highway Administration, both to define what we wanted to search for, but also to create our search filters, which were then further tailored for each review purpose. So our first review was, again, the broad review of just congestion pricing literature over time. So to do this, we did our structured literature review that used semi-supervised and machine learning methods for the screening, and then bibliometric analysis to examine our final selected records. So with this project, we first identified over 13,000 potentially relevant records for this research and narrowed it down to 2,333 final records for our review using the inclusion criteria you see here. So that included peer-reviewed publications and reports, abstracts in English, examining a road traffic-related toll-based congestion pricing policy, and having both a pricing component and a traffic congestion component. Any manual reference screening was done in Covidence, and then VOS Viewer was used to create our final network maps. So one domain that we looked at in this project were title and abstract terms. And this is where we pulled any key term that came from the title and abstract of all 2,000 plus records that were identified in the final extraction to identify major themes that have really popped up in the research to date. And with that, we were able to create this map in VOS Viewer. And I know it looks a little crazy, but I promise to guide you through this. So first, we identified 7 distinct clusters of terms that you can see with the different colors here. Out of these, problem, network, and lane were our three most commonly used terms. And then we also had three large clusters that you see here. So the first large cluster was in blue, and this was congestion pricing types and structural implementation. So these were records that really talked about this theme, and they used terms like lane, high occupancy toll, and peak period. Our second cluster is the one in green, and these are records that really focused on modeling methods and approaches. So that's where we see terms like network, algorithm, user equilibrium, pricing model. And our final cluster focuses on population perceptions and relevant effects. So this is where we see records that talk about attitudes and acceptability, and also what Masha was talking about with pollution and external costs. So overall, from this part of the project, we found that the earliest publication year for any congestion pricing policy, specifically to toll-based policies, came in 1956, but that we saw real notable increases in publications in 1989. Again, the most common terms used were problem, network, and lane. And the really prominent themes in research were implementation, acceptability, and modeling approaches. But the bibliometric analysis also allowed us to identify some gaps where there really was a lack of research. And these gaps included impacts on specific road user types and modes. So we didn't see too much that focused on outcomes for specific road users like pedestrians and motorcyclists. We also saw a relative lack of research on equity and safety as it relates to congestion pricing policy. So the next part of our work focused on that last gap, which is safety, because we really wanted to understand what some of the safety impacts were and what it looks like in the research to date. So for this review, we conducted a scoping review using similar inclusion criteria to the previous review. So again, peer-reviewed publications or reports, abstracts in English, discussing at least one road traffic-related toll-based congestion pricing policy, and having both a pricing component and a traffic congestion component. But they also needed to discuss safety impacts of the policy that they described. Further, we excluded any policies that were focused on creating revenue rather than reducing congestion. So with this review, we first identified 366 studies from our 4 databases, and using our inclusion-exclusion criteria, narrowed this down to 18 final relevant publications that were included in our extraction. Publication dates for this review ranged from 1989 to 2021. So as you may recall from that previous review, 1989 is when we also started to see an uptick in congestion pricing policy literature in general. Overall, the majority of our publications were peer-reviewed publications, and they used either observed data only, simulated data only, or some type of combination of both. And while this study did include any type of toll-based congestion pricing policy, zone and cordon-based policies were the most commonly evaluated type. So out of all of these studies, the most common type of safety outcome measured were crashes, including both injury and non-injury crashes. And other outcomes included car casualties or outcomes with specific injury severity, such as slightly injured or killed. Other studies had more indirect measures, such as economic valuations of measured safety outcomes. So while these studies varied in terms of the methods they used, the types of data they used, and the outcomes examined, we were able to kind of synthesize some of the broad trends that were observed. And overall, we found that studies found potential safety benefits for multiple road users after implementing a policy. So estimated crash reductions were up to 35% after implementation, and changes in fatality estimates ranged anywhere from no changes to 33% reductions. And then when we started to look at specific road user types, that's when we started to see variations in our trends. So for motorcycles, studies that examined this outcome observed an initial increase immediately after implementing the policy, followed by a reversal in injuries. Some studies that looked at bicycle outcomes found the same pattern as motorcycles, while other studies observed immediate decreases in injuries, but long-term increases. And finally, for pedestrians, one study that looked at a 10-year projection after implementation found a decrease, but a shorter-term study observed an immediate decrease in injury followed by a slight increase by 3 years. So our overall findings suggest that policies can have a positive impact on road user safety, but that these trends start to vary when you look at each independent road user type, and sometimes include periods of increases in injury events. Further, when we started to consider some of the reasons for these varying trends, a lot of these authors attributed these trends to transportation mode shifts. So, for example, you implement a policy, you see more people switch from cars to a motorcycle maybe, and then that leads to that initial increase that you observe after implementation. So next steps based on this is that we definitely need more research on safety impacts just across the board, but also with specific congestion pricing policy types. And then when you're thinking in terms of implementation, cities and regions that are considering these policies really need to think about safety impacts, not only in the short term after implementing the policy, but also long-term outcomes as well. So all of this led to the third part of our project, which looked at specifically pedestrian safety and the impacts of congestion pricing policies on these outcomes using a system dynamic simulation model. So for this part of the project, we first designed our simulation model and then used the simulation model to examine multiple scenarios, specifically in the context of the outlying region of Manhattan here, which I'm learning is a central business district. So the first part of this process was to create what we call a causal loop diagram. And this is really just to help us understand the underlying dynamics that contribute to pedestrian injuries in a system. So this first started off with using a model designed from previous extensively researched work that studied pedestrian injuries, and then was further modified using interviews and consultations with individuals and groups from different areas of expertise to really tailor this model to New York and Manhattan specifically. So second part of this was building the actual simulation model. So those feedback loops that you saw in the earlier figure were built up using data from multiple sources, including mobility surveys and reports, census and American Community Survey data, freight vehicle data, for hire vehicle data, and many other sources. And then that was used to create and refine the simulation model. Finally, we verified, validated, and calibrated the model to make sure that it was working the way it was intended. So as you can see here, one of our calibration results was to look at the outcome of the number of pedestrian injuries per year. And you can see in the solid line, that's our observed data from those years. And the simulated line is presented in the dashed line. And you can kind of see that the simulator predicted very closely to the actual observed trends. So now that we know that the simulated data really compares and fits with the observed trends, we were able to proceed with this project. So this is just one of the outcomes that we were able to use the simulator model for. We looked at the estimated number of pedestrian injuries per year. We examined 8 different scenarios, and these were varying combinations of implementing a congestion pricing policy, having or not having infrastructure investments, taxing for hire vehicles, and speed reduction. So for the purposes of this simulator, we used 2022 as the year when the model assumed policy implementation. And congestion pricing implementation assumed a $6 average charge in each directions for vehicles entering and exiting that highlighted region. And then the revenue being used to improve the metro system. So what you can see here in the gray line, this is our, what I'm going to call baseline or policy scenario 0. And that's what would happen if a congestion pricing policy was not implemented. So you see virtually no changes in injuries. But when you start to consider some of these first policies, we actually start to see increases. So these increases with the first 3 scenarios ranged anywhere from 2% to 17%. And then finally, when we look at the last 4 scenarios, 4A through 5B, that's when we start to see decreases in the number of pedestrian injuries per year after implementation. So briefly, this is just a screenshot of what the simulator looks like, because it is something that you can access online, and it does let you play with the different components of these scenarios, and you can adjust those to any way you like to see how that looks when you're projecting out to 2030. And the link is here if you would like to check that out. So finally, just overall key findings from this simulation part of the project. All of those scenarios that I showed you on the earlier slide resulted in some type of congestion improvement, meaning that there was a reduction in the average number of daily vehicles traveling into and around that region, regardless of which variation you implemented. But when you started to look at pedestrian safety, injury trends really varied by scenario type. So some scenarios had improvements in safety, so reductions in pedestrian injury, while other scenarios resulted in decreased safety or increases in pedestrian injuries. So the key takeaways from this are that implementing a policy with other pedestrian efforts could have really strong potential for improving public health and safety. But implementing a policy while removing infrastructure investments could have a deleterious effect on pedestrian safety. These are just some extra resources, papers, a report about this project. Again, here's the link where you can access that simulation model and additional resources on road safety and other work that we do here out of UNC. And thank you for your time. My email's here. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or ask them at the end of the session.
Thank you so much, Bhavna. That was fascinating. And I was writing down questions that I'm looking forward to asking as soon as we move to our question and answer section. But before we do that, we're going to shift gears just a little bit from these excellent specific research findings that we heard from Masha and Bhavna to a 20,000-foot view of applying this type of research to policy. We're very fortunate to have reflections from Barry Shearman, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but has provided video remarks. He is a British Labour and cooperative politician who has served as the Member of Parliament for Huddersfield since 1979 and is based in London, where they have a world-renowned congestion pricing program. Barry is Labour's longest continuously serving MP in the current Parliament and is a keen social enterpriser. He is currently the chair of the Westminster Commission for Road Air Quality and the president of the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety. So the perfect person to be speaking today at this intersection of safety and air quality and sustainability. We have several clips. We've had to shorten a little bit for time's sake, in which Barry can remind us of the importance of pairing personal stories and passion with the research findings as we push for both traffic safety and climate sustainability. Of course, we all know that such change is very incremental, and the research at times not only tells us what we know, but also what we still need to learn, which I think we also heard today from both Masha and Bhavna. So Lawrence, I think you're going to run the video for us. So if I can turn it over to you.
Sure thing. I'm gonna try sharing, and the video will play in its entirety, 12 minutes, 12, about 13 minutes. 1 second. Let's see.
Hello, I'm Barry Shearman, Member of Parliament for Huddersfield. I'm the longest serving Member of Parliament but one. So I'm nearly the father of the house, and father of the house on my side, which is at the moment the opposition side. So I've been a Member of Parliament since 1979. Some of you might know that's when Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, but I am an opposition Labour Member of Parliament. I suppose you'd think of me as a Democrat. And I have been involved in road safety issues for a very long time. Like most of us who are interested in road safety, we have personal knowledge of accidents. I saw 2 young people dying by the side of the road. They'd been thrown out of a car because they were not wearing any restraints. I never forget that. I myself, when coming home from a baptism many years ago with our little daughters, we were in a crash, head-on crash, with a driver who had just come off the ferry and was driving on the wrong side of the road. Luckily, because the seat belts in our car, and it was a big giant of a car in those days, we survived. We were shaken up, but we survived. We were lucky. So I have a passion about road safety. And also, I do a lot of social enterprise, and you know what I believe in. If you want to make change, you get together a bunch of people who are good, they're knowledgeable, they have wisdom, but they also have experience and they have passion. Passion is probably the most important. So when I got into Parliament, I wanted to change the law about compulsory seatbelts. At that time, seatbelts were not mandatory to be fitted or to be worn. They increasingly became fitted in all cars, but there had been 13th attempts to introduce seatbelts in the United Kingdom. They'd all failed. I got into Parliament and I introduced first a small bill to stop any child being carried in a car without restraint. And I was very lucky, it became law. So that was a step. Way back in 1981. And interestingly enough, of course, at that time, the leader of the opposition, Michael Foot, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, were against compulsory seatbelts. They thought it was against, individual rights and all that. And so I then got started working behind the scenes, working with any colleagues, cross-party, this is not a party political issue, and we amended a bill that was coming down from the House of Lords. Now the House of Lords had kindly, with a wonderful man who'd been a transport minister and a Conservative minister, he had amended the bill and it had been passed in the Lords. It came down into the House of Commons for a vote on that Lord's amendments on the night before the royal wedding, Charles and Diana. And that night we had a little American intern working in my office. We don't have big staffs, or certainly didn't in those days, ringing round members of the House of Lords, anyone who was medical, anyone who had any history of safety or health in the House of Lords. And we worked darned hard. And on that special day, we kept our troops there, they didn't, and we got compulsory seatbelts. To check how many lives have been saved, it's a considerable, it's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. The fact of the matter, of course, is that probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me was a senior person I work with in the World Health Organization, the United Nations World Health Organization, which isn't always, I don't always agree with the WHO, but this person who I respect said Barry Shearman, because of his dedicated enthusiasm and passion for road safety, has probably saved more lives than any politician on the planet, which I thought a bit of an exaggeration, but nice. When we managed to form this coalition to get compulsory seatbelts in the United Kingdom, there was one of the big motoring organisations. There were casualty surgeons, there were police, there were specialists in road safety in local councils. A really good group of people, some very senior professors and academics and researchers, because I've always believed, good evidence, high quality research on everything that we do. So here it was, a whole bunch of people that said, we've done it, we've got seatbelts. Where do we go from now? And we decided, let's stay together, because there's many other things we can do to save lives on the road. And so we formed ourselves, it was briefly called SAG, and awful names, Safety and Transport Action Group. And then someone said, we need a posher name. And so we called ourselves the Parliamentary Advisory Council on Transport Safety. And of course, even to today, we do road safety, we do air safety, and we do rail safety. So we cover the ground. PACS, the Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, we were making very good headway in the United Kingdom on many safety issues. And of course, we did it by having the very best scientists and experts in working parties. So the working parties came through with ideas based on evidence, and then we campaigned them in the country, in the media, and of course in Parliament. But steadily, we had just joined the European Union, and many of the decisions were being made in Europe, in Brussels. And so we got together, I think it was the Dutch, the Germans, the Swedes and ourselves, and we started the European Transport Safety Council. And the ETSC still is alive and well today, and it is the most prominent transport safety organisation. I'm still on the one of the trustees, and of course that has a European remit. And of course, when we were successful in the United Kingdom, both the governor of of New York, who was of course someone you will all remember, and the governor of California, who was a Demajan at the time, asked me to come to California, to Los Angeles, and to launch their transport safety initiative for compulsory seatbelt wearing. In New York, of course, it was Governor Cuomo in those days. And I had a very pleasant visit to New York, came to the Capitol and spoke, and had a very, very good reception. And of course, we know that I remember having quite a fight with Ralph Nader on radio and television, because Ralph Nader didn't want compulsory seatbelts because he thought that would slow up having airbags, which I always thought was a nonsense. We needed both. So the fact of the matter is, I suppose the great thing I have enjoyed is both being active in the United Kingdom and then sharing in a kind of humble way, not saying we know everything, to other parts of the world. And following that, I was asked to be involved in the World Bank's Global Road Safety Partnership, and eventually became chairman of the Global Road Safety Partnership. And that was based, of course, in Geneva with the Red Cross. And so I did that for a number of years, and much later there was an initiative to have all legislators worldwide communicating for road safety. People forget, you know, that the biggest cause of death for children and young people worldwide is still death on the road accidents. It's not COVID, it's not any disease, it is, I have to tell you, road accidents. And so this is why it's still so important. I think that all of us recognise that we need far more activity, far more focus on where the casualties actually occur. And one of the things that I'm very proud of is the last organisation. You might think I'm always starting things, and I am. I'm a social enterpriser. But we started this International Council for Road Safety Research, ICORSI. It's an organisation that is linked nowadays on social media, on the ways that we now, only in the last 2 years, have realised we can work worldwide. And one of the great things that ICORSI has done, which we launched at the ministers, the United Nations Transport Ministers meeting in Stockholm, just before COVID really stopped all transport and all conferences, we launched a piece of research that we'd done on a shoestring. We looked at every piece of research on transport safety for the last 60 years. Every piece of research for the last 60 years. And we came out of that, and it all, it had to be of a good standard. It was all evaluated by professors, emeritus professors, by high quality people, cross-referenced and very carefully judged. And so we now have, as a resource, all the research in road safety for the last 60 years. And what is important about that isn't that just that we know what research has taken place, we know where research has not taken place. It jumps out of the data. Very little research on two-wheel traffic in places like Africa, or even three-wheel traffic. But it's a great treasury of information for researchers. And so across the piece, whether it's World Health Organization and global legislators for road safety, which I've chaired for a number of years, I've stood down from that. These global organizations need to stick together, need all the time to be re-energized. It's too easy for what in this country we call the blob to take them over. You know, we need to keep individuals working together, passionate individuals. And although I respect the United Nations, I respect the World Health Organization and the World Bank, but nothing is better than a group of highly motivated people that want change and are going to make the institutions accept that change. Being something of a social enterpriser, I am always looking for new challenges. And I started working with a very good group called OWLS, Optimized Waste Logistics, because I'm also a passionate environmentalist. I worry deeply about climate change and global warming. And again, using the same methodology, good science, good research, in order to find the answers that we need. And one area that I quickly became, and as a politician, I'm always looking for things that capture the public imagination. And I met a group of people who were working on air quality and the relationship with air quality to transport. And the more I saw the research and got the information that I needed, myself and many of my colleagues in this sector saw that this enormous threat to the health of human beings in towns and cities across the world, which was caused by bad air, poisonous air. And because most of us think that the air we breathe must, if we can't see any smog or fog, it's good and clean air. Well, to pinch something from the Declaration of Independence, I believe there is an inalienable right for human beings to breathe clean air. And I increasingly work with medical and other researchers, like Sir Stephen Holgate, who believed and had the research material to show that the air that we breathe in towns and cities is seriously injurious to health. We have now woken up to the fact that any busy road is not a safe road. It's not safe in terms of the hazards of having an accident and being hurt or killed, but it's also not a safe road in terms of what you're going to be breathing in. Much of our research shows that in the car, in the cab of a truck, you're breathing in poisonous air inside and outside. And of course, we are looking at practical ways to get at that terrible cause of pollution. The more research we had on the quality of air that we were breathing in the United Kingdom, in London and our big cities and communities, the more we got worried. There was a very high-profile case of a young girl who, living in Lewisham in the centre of London, had asthma, but there was absolutely medical evidence that her death had been partially caused by the air that she breathed, the very bad air that she breathed, because her home was right by the side of a very busy road. And the more we looked at this, the more evidence we got, we found that particularly vehicles that were emitting diesel fumes were causing a high degree of the pollution, not just NOx, but the platelets on NOx, and all these things that affected not only the health of pregnant women, elderly people, children. This was a very real problem. And of course, we also discovered, because we had good research evidence, that when people took their children to school and thought, well, they're now inside, and so the bad air that's outside the school is excluded, we emphatically took evidence that suggested that's not true, that the bad air seeps in to the buildings and is held there and is probably as bad, if not worse, than the air outside. And we tested that in the House of Commons, here in the House of Commons. I've got an air quality sensor. This is a very expensive one. I think it's worth about $5,000, but we have smaller ones, cheaper ones, that we've been wearing in this Palace of Westminster and in our constituencies. And all that shows emphatically that we are really way above the World Health Organization's recommended levels of pollution. All the people, the 5,000 people who work in Parliament, well above. In this room, relatively new, 5-story building, we're 5 floors up here. The air in this room, ever since this thing has been monitoring it, has never been up to World Health standards. So there is a real problem here. And we have started a range of measures that we're trying to get through Parliament that will address this problem. I believe, and have always believed, and so have my colleagues, in practical solutions. If we can actually, stop people in their tracks and say, do you know that this is a real problem, this contaminated air? And there are ways we can deal with it. We can stop people constructing cars, manufacturing cars that pollute. They could move to a new fuel. We all know that there is tremendous change happening actually with bigger vehicles, and it's going to trickle down to smaller, of hydrogen power and other alternatives. Battery power perhaps, but with heavy goods vehicles, with trucks, that isn't an easy solution. But hydrogen is increasingly, for buses, hydrogen is becoming a real possibility. And then for smaller vehicles, while we're waiting for new technologies and the spread of more electric cars, we also can do practical things. I introduced a bill recently on diesel particulates. We have what we call a MOT, a test of the worthiness, roadworthiness of your vehicle every year. And you take it into a garage, it has to be an approved one, and it's tested. And if it fails the test, you don't get the car back till it's fixed. This simple test of a diesel particulate and whether the diesel particulate filter is working is simple, but it isn't good enough. And in places like the Netherlands and in Scandinavia, they have a much more stringent test, not only to make sure the device is there, but it works. But no one has all the answers. Some societies, some countries, some local city mayors have some of the answers. But if we're going to get anywhere, we've got to share the good practice and the good innovation. I've always believed that, and I think it is true today. And for example, we have a direct vision standard in the United Kingdom that the United States could learn from. There's much in the United States that we could learn from in the United Kingdom. I emigrated to the United States when I was a very young man, and I think I still have a green card somewhere. And of course, I have a passion and a love for the United States. The United States has done some of the best research in transport safety, road safety, and in air safety. And I applaud that. But we've always got room to learn from each other. I'm always surprised that those darn Nordic countries, the Scandinavians, seem to be a little ahead in so many things, and the Netherlands as well. But no one is the best at everything. And so I hope in the future that we in the big cities, London and New York and right across the world, can share both in road safety and in terms of bringing down the problem of pollution that is killing so many of our citizens. One of these really good events that are coming up is Fleet Vision International. It's going to be held, it's the show. It's going to really focus on many things involving fleets and truck fleets, but it's also going to be really focusing on the road safety and road air quality aspects of what we're all interested in. So, as I say, let's all learn from another. And I have to believe, you don't all do it on social media. You don't all do it on gizmos on your computer. I still believe that people do best and do fastest meeting together, looking each other in the eye, speaking, talking, and as I said at the beginning, getting people together that have knowledge, experience and passion and get something done. Well, it's next year. I'm really looking forward to, as many people in this sector are, of the New York City's Fleet Show. That's something that's been very dear to the heart of both Eric and Keith. We are very fond of both those guys, and we want to make sure that your show is as successful as ours, in fact more successful than ours, if that is humanly possible. So we look forward in the future to working together.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. And I want to virtually thank Barry again for being here in spirit, and also re-emphasizing the strength of sharing good practices, not only nationally, but also internationally. So we now have some time for questions for Masha and Bhavna, and a bit of discussion about what things look like at this intersection of traffic safety and also our aims to create a sustainable city and sustainable roads. And so I want to open it up to anybody to unmute yourselves, and also to put in questions in the chat, etc. And I have a few as well, but I see one has already come in from Rob. This is a question for Bhavna. The question is asking how the different outcomes were modeled. I assume that's the outcomes. Rob, correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free to come off mute. But the outcomes that were presented for the CPP,
yeah. Let me expand. So I'm just very interested in. You got some very different results with the implementation of congestion pricing, but it wasn't totally clear to me exactly what those different variables were, like, that created those different results. I would assume, all things being equal, you would see probably a small reduction in injuries just from reduced volumes, but maybe you could just go into that in a little more detail.
Like for the simulation results specifically?
Yeah, that's right. Because
Okay.
it seemed like you were saying with no, well, like one was like maybe like getting rid of Vision Zero funding or something, and one
Yeah,
was
let me go ahead and
like,
share this screen. That might help so we can look at this figure again. So with this one, with these different scenarios, so implementing the congestion pricing policy only was that $6 charge for entering the zone. And then Vision Zero investments expiring. This scenario is basically saying you're implementing the policy, but we're not continuing any infrastructure investments. That
so
might have been.
How did you, what are those investments? Like what, like, where'd you get a number for, like? I
think all the numbers were pulled from other research. I think I'd have to go back and specifically check, but it was just to make it was basically to represent, we're implementing this policy, but maybe are we able to handle that increased flow of pedestrians? Because the idea of what was happening with scenario 2 is that we can implement the policy, which leads to more subway trips, fewer for-hire vehicle trips, and then more pedestrian exposure to vehicles and those increased vehicle speeds due to reduced congestion. That's kind of broadly what's happening with that one. Or with that, sorry, that's scenario 1. With scenario 2, that was happening, but is even worse because there wasn't enough infrastructure to really make sure that pedestrians were able to stay safe and reduce that exposure. But I can definitely look into that further and get back to you on the details.
Yeah, because just safety investments made over a period of like 10, 20 years, they don't just, they never just stop. Like most of them just stay fixed, right?
I imagine with that, it's probably more realistic that what we see in scenarios 4A and 4B are what would happen, because you do have some existing infrastructure investments and hopefully those continue to occur. But yes, this was just to test the different scenarios, just to see what those different components will do.
Yeah, I guess that's the main, I don't want to take up too much time, but that's the main thing I was trying to get out of this, that what you found was, without doing anything, basically the increase in speeds with also stimulating pedestrian activity at the same time was going to result in more pedestrian injury.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think the goal here is, if we're thinking about congestion pricing policy implementation, we cannot let up on some of the other improvements that are going on, that we need to
Gotcha.
take those into account. We need to take into account that people are switching to different modes. And so we need to address those travel modes as well, and not just roadways and cars that are on those roads.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob and Bhavna. I have just a quick question while we're on this slide as well. I wanted to understand number 3, which I think is saying that you would have the congestion pricing with a tax on for-hire vehicles. Is the thought there that the tax would raise the cost of using a for-hire vehicle so you would have more pedestrians? Or I'm just, why does
Yeah.
that increase pedestrian?
If using a for-hire vehicle is more expensive, then that could again encourage shifts to the subway system. So that was the idea there.
And that would result in more, because people are walking to and from the subway.
People are
and
walking,
so
you
therefore
have
you would have
fewer for-hire vehicles. So again, the more pedestrians, fewer vehicles, so then potentially increased speeds of the cars that are still there.
I see. Thank you. That's great. Well, not great, but very interesting to see that aspect, particularly given we know, although this focus was on reducing congestion and those types of policies, we know that those policies come with revenue, and then how we use those revenue is so important. And a good portion of that is related to mode shifting and hoping people will take public transportation. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting to see that piece without the other intentional work to try to reduce the risks for pedestrians. So thank you. Does anybody else have questions specifically around the simulation that Bhavna presented, or that area? Before we move on, we have another question in the chat for Masha, but just wanted to keep space in case there were additional questions for Bhavna. Okay. All right. I've been practicing my 3 long breaths before jumping in virtual spaces. Okay. We have a great question here for Masha from Catherine, asking whether or not the reductions in both NOx and PM that she observed and during this shutdown could also be used to investigate health impacts, and noting, of course, that there could be some challenge there because we know that there was reduced use of hospitals during the pandemic as well. And Catherine, please jump in if you want to clarify that further, and turn it to you and Masha.
Yeah, I was recently doing a lit review on the benefits of electric vehicles and saw this literature about, of course, the NOx and PM health impacts. And one of my colleagues warned me that there's some hesitancy to accept results that find negative health impacts from living near highways, that there might be correlated with something else related to living near highways. But it seems like we have a bit of a natural experiment where we can separate living near a highway and exposure to emissions. So it struck me as possibly a natural experiment, although maybe not perfect.
Yeah, that's a great question, Catherine. I mean, I think the proper thing to do would be for me to turn it over to any epidemiologists on the call to respond to this question. But I do know that, 2020 was a very anomalous year for many reasons, but also, like you said, people were hesitant to use hospitals. So records of, the health outcomes that we would normally use to find the associations between air pollution exposure and health outcomes, they're a little wonky in 2020. So as a natural experiment for health associations, I think 2020 probably not the best period to do it.
Thanks, Masha. Is there anybody else that would like to add to that? I have one additional thought as well, but
I could just throw in one thought. Just I'm not an epidemiologist, but and I'm sure there's lots of ways of testing this. But just in New York City, in particular, there with the asthma piece, it's not very associated with presence of highways. It's just, it follows different populations and regions of the city, and there's places that are very dense with highways with low asthma rates and places and the opposite. So but maybe there's other ways of I'm sure there's other ways of measuring the impacts as well.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, and I will just add that this is an area that we've done a lot of work in at the health department, and there's a number of different ways that we can estimate the health impacts, specifically from changes in air quality. And when I am done talking, because I can't do two things at once, I'm going to put in the chat a couple of resources. So one, you may already be familiar with the EPA's COBRA tool that allows for looking at the county level for changes in criteria pollutants and then associated health impacts that we would expect from those. And we have a tool that we developed here at the health department with partners at UNC that allows looking at those same types of changes at the zip code level within the city and the state. So I will put that into the chat so folks can take a look at that. It's a good way to think about policy and potential impacts. And then I'm also going to put in the chat some resources from our Environment and Health Data Portal, which have a number of different health impact assessments from air quality changes. And I see that Sarah Johnson, our air quality director, is on the line. So why don't you add to that, Sarah?
Yes, I just wanted to pipe up and just I think the additional thing that you were alluding to, the person who made the comment, was noise, and it is very true that noise independent of air pollution associated with roadways can have, trigger stress responses and have, impacts on sleep and therefore health. There are some good studies out there in the literature where they have, using very sort of sophisticated and innovative kind of control groups, have figured out ways to tease that apart as far as health impacts go. But it is really an interesting and challenging area and important.
Thanks, Sarah. And great. So great questions. Is there anybody else that has a question or would like to put that in the chat or unmute for Masha or Bhavna?
I have a question.
2-minute warning.
Thank you, Fiona.
Question
Anna?
for Masha and Bhavna. When you're looking at the potential impacts of congestion pricing, or of, in the case of the COVID shutdown, the decreased roadways, how can we understand what happens not just in the area itself, but also in the surrounding areas? I know that's a big concern, that folks are worried there's going to be extra traffic just outside the zone or extra traffic elsewhere.
Yeah, I can chime in for a short, I'll try to be brief about it. I mean, the New York City Community Air Survey, which I described a little bit in the first few slides of my presentation, we have about 100 monitors throughout the city, and we plan to analyze air pollution all over the city to see how it changes, and sort of the same way that we looked at changes in air pollution in tandem with changes in sources during pause, we also plan to do that for when congestion pricing is implemented.
I'm trying to think back through some of the studies that I've seen that specifically focused on areas adjacent to congestion charging zones. I know one that found that because vehicles were kind of forced out of those charging areas, we actually started to see decreased speeds and decreased injuries in the adjacent areas. And that was similar to another project, I think, that came out of the UK, where they looked at different distances outside of the charging zone, and the further out you got, the less of a safety improvement that you observed, because people were less likely to bring their cars from outside into an area where they knew they had to pay for congestion toll. So there definitely are some positive impacts in terms of safety, even adjacent to a charging zone.
Thanks.
Great. So I think we are right at time. So I just want to thank both of our presenters again so much for your extremely interesting and informative presentations, and also again to our virtual guest from Barry Sherman from the UK. Really appreciated that as well. And thank you all for engaging in a robust discussion at the end there. So I'll turn it over. I'm not sure who I'm turning it over to. Anna.
I'll take it.
Geraldine.
Or Geraldine.
Sure. Thanks, Carrie. And just want to thank the presenters for that really informative session. So next, we're going to open up the breakout rooms for 2 concurrent sessions on enforcement and education. And the second is emerging trends in e-micromobility. So you can choose to attend either of these sessions by choosing join in the breakout room pop-up that will be there. And the next session will begin at 10:55, so you have a 5-minute break. Then there will be another break after that. And then at 12:15, the concurrent breakout sessions will be starting at 12:15 p.m. will be on speeding and substances and driving. So again, you get to choose which breakout session you want to attend. And then we'll have a break from 1:15 to 1:20 p.m. And I will see you all back here in the full room at 1:20 for our road design and wrap up. So Anna, I don't know if you've got anything else you'd like to add.
We're just going to echo you and say a few minutes break at 10:55. We'll start the breakout rooms. See you all soon.
Thank you.